But so basically what's going to happen is this is a model tour. A lot of people have been asking me about, like, because it's difficult to practice, or we're not actually on location, how do I best understand what he's looking for in its like model tour or evaluative process? And my best advice for you is look at the script we have. Definitely have those facts down, but especially now that we're not at school, what really I think matters more than being able to like, spit out all the facts is to be able to give a tour that's very much your own. So if I miss, bullet points on this script, that's not a big deal for the purpose of this model tour, because I'm going to spend my time trying to focus on personal stories that I give on my tour, that are kind of like good representative examples of how you can put a personal spin on your evaluations. And this is good for you because it gives you kind of examples, as I said, and it's also good for us as people who are like, deliberating, because all these stories are specific to me, so you can't plagiarize them, or at least that's my intention. But honestly, like, there's a lot of stuff in here that I'll talk a lot about, like kind of historical, examples that I've looked through in my own research. And I encourage anyone, you don't need the Inside Harvard book. Not that the book is bad, but your own historical research would probably be more personal. And so I'll give you a couple examples of kind of areas in my tour where I've tried to exceed the tour outline. Okay, so info center tour, and I guess let me get a stopwatch as well out so I don't waste your time. Hey everyone, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to Harvard. I'm glad you all could come on this virtual tour with me today. My name is Nathan. I'm going to be your tour guide. I'm a junior here at Harvard College, and I study environmental science and public policy, which is a complicated way to say that, sometimes I'm looking a lot at plants, and other times I'm looking a lot at the economics of climate change. So it's a pretty wide major, and I'll talk a lot about it. But I'm going to talk a lot about history today and a lot about my experience as a Harvard College student. Feel free to ask me questions really whenever throughout the tour, because I'm here for you all. So glad you could join me from all across the world today. So we'll get started and walk across the street. And as we enter Harvard Yard, you'll notice that on our right, we're passing this magnificent yellow, old-looking house. And that's called the Wadsworth House. Right now, it's just administrative offices for the college. Actually, it's a really interesting space inside. It's kind of where the college receives foreign diplomats. And so often if my tour organization, Crimson Key, if we get like a special diplomat that we need to give a tour to, we meet them in the Wadsworth House. But going back hundreds of years, Wadsworth House has a really interesting history. It was actually the home of some of the earliest presidents at Harvard, Presidents Wadsworth and Longfellow, who were presidents in the late 1600s. And as a result, it has a lot of cool stories associated with it. One of which is that for a brief time in the American Revolutionary War, George Washington actually stayed in the Wadsworth House with the Continental Army in Harvard Yard. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but unfortunately, George Washington wasn't there for very long because he thought the Wadsworth House wasn't fancy enough for him. So he actually went off campus, and he ended up residing in a mansion, I believe, on Brattle Street, which is just right down the way. But as we move into the yard, this kind of like, I would say, as I'm passing by the Wadsworth House, and let's say right about now, we're going to reach Matthews Hall. So I'll put that on my background. So I was just talking a little bit about Wadsworth House as we entered Harvard Yard. And now we're kind of at our first stop. This is right outside Matthews Hall. And I was talking a little bit about Harvard's history. And Harvard's history is very, very extensive. We're the oldest college in all of the United States. And coincidentally, the area that we just walked by is where the first buildings on Harvard's campus were built, all the way back in 1636. And Harvard back then wasn't the spacious, magnificent college campus that it is today. You know, it was a one building shack, basically, that was built where Gray's Hall is now, which is a freshman dormitory that you can see over there. um, and so Harvard was very small in 1636. It looked a lot different, and its student body looked very different as well. Um, and so not only was it a much less spacious environment with much fewer people, but the people were very different. Does anyone want to guess how Harvard's student body could have been different back in 1636?
I do.
Anyone can. Sure.
I think it was probably a lot less diverse.
Thank you, Leah.
You're welcome.
You are
I'll repeat
completely
myself.
correct. So Harvard's student body has gone through a variety of changes in our time. And I'll talk about a couple of them right now. So Harvard, interestingly enough, was founded as an all-male divinity school. So it was created to educate the men who would then become priests in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You know, this is before even the United States existed back in 1636. And so Harvard was founded actually by residents of this colony, Mass Bay Colony, who wanted to give their sons a priestly education. Um, and interestingly enough, as well, Harvard's original name wasn't Harvard University. We didn't actually get our current name until a very generous, handsome gentleman came along in 1638. And he donated a lot of stuff to us, including the land that we're standing on today, as well as his entire collection of books, over 400 of them in a variety of scientific instruments. That man's name, of course, was, as you could probably guess, John Harvard. He was himself an Anglican minister that came over. He was living in Cambridge, England, and then he came over to Harvard or came over to Newtown College, donated his land, and he donated all of his stuff actually as he lied dying on his deathbed, because in 1638, John Harvard died, I believe, of I believe it was tuberculosis. And so it was a tragic early death for someone who had just come over to America with his, or what would become America with his family. But as a result, you know, we got our first benefactor and really got us started on the trajectory we are today. So that was back in 1638. And as you can imagine, all white, all future priests, Harvard wasn't very diverse. And a fundamental, you know, aspect of our diversity, even before one begins to think about things like socioeconomic status or race, was the inclusion of gender in our college. So originally there were no women in Harvard College at all. And although that's not to say that there weren't important women who were involved in the leadership of Harvard University. For example, in 1642, we had a woman, Anne Radcliffe, who donated our first money towards our endowment. And so a lot of that kind of began this tradition of a generous endowment providing, you know, generous financial aid to students even back in 1642. So Anne Radcliffe was really this visionary in terms of the financial status of students at our college. And it wasn't until in the late 1800s, actually, that she was honored by the creation of Radcliffe College, which was the first academic space where women could be included in Harvard's campus. It was actually a separate college located where the Graduate School of Education is, just a 5-minute walk from the yard today. And that was in, I believe, 1872. But still, in the late 1800s, over 200 years after Harvard was founded, you had practically no ethnic diversity. You just had women studying at a separate college that was, by the way, called the Annex at the time, colloquially. So they were very much separated from Harvard, and it wasn't until the early 1940s that we began to have women here at the college. And that was because of a very important event that was going on overseas that was actually distracting many of the male students we had here at the college. Can anyone guess what was going on around 1939 onwards?
World War II.
You are absolutely correct, Ethan Johnstone. That was you, right, Ethan?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, World War II was raging, and as a result, almost every able-bodied young man in the United States was overseas fighting in the war. And as a result, there were a ton of vacancies in Harvard College classrooms here in the yard. And those vacancies were filled by Radcliffe College women for the first time, and began the process of educational integration at our college in terms of gender. This wasn't really completed until very recently, actually. I won't, go through all of the details, but I'll give you a brief timeline. It wasn't until the early 1970s that we began to have women included in our residential life, and this was as part of. Oh man, it's on the outline, but I'm blanking on the name of what it was called. But does anyone know? It was like they called it something colloquially.
The Great Experiment, I think.
Yeah, the Great Experiment. That's what it was. So usually I tell a joke about how the 70s was an experimental time in everything from music to drugs to gendered housing. But I blew that, so I'll skip that. But anyways, in the 1970s, the Great Experiment occurred at Harvard, and it was a revolutionary time. And what happened was some Harvard College men and Radcliffe College women decided they were going to live in the same building, of course separated by suite, but it was a glorious revolution, one might say. And nowadays, every building at Harvard College is integrated with regard to gender. But it wasn't until, so by the 70s, you had classrooms and living situation pretty much integrated. Ironically, it wasn't until 1999 that Harvard College women ended up getting the same degree as men. They formerly still had Radcliffe College degrees. So in 1999, that process of integration was completed. You can imagine that our process of integration has followed a similar trend in other things such as socioeconomic diversity and ethnic diversity. I'll give a little anecdote right now about ethnic diversity because we started on a similarly horrendous path here in our early history. And this is a story that, not a lot of tour guides might have told you, like, a couple decades ago or even up to a couple years ago, but very recently, we want to include it. And especially because the rest of my tour is going to be overwhelmingly, positive about Harvard. I always like to talk a little bit about, what we could have done better. And one instance of this absolutely is the Harvard Indian College. So right behind me, Matthews Hall, formerly, when they were building Matthews Hall in the late 1800s, I believe in the 1870s, they found the foundations to another building in the, kind of the sub-levels of Matthews Hall. And with a little bit of historical research, they determined that this building was the remnants of the Harvard Indian College, which was established on a grant from the king in the 1640s. I believe it was 1642, the same year Anne Radcliffe donated that money. But in 1642, the Harvard College accepted a large sum of money from the colony of Massachusetts from the king in order to create a college, the Harvard Indian College, that would educate Native American students. Harvard College ended up using almost all of this money to finance its other activities, built a modest building instead of what it promised, and there were only 4 students who were ever graduated from the Harvard Indian College, 2 of whom died of, I believe it was smallpox, one of whom died at sea as a mariner, and the other who went on to have a moderately successful career. So we took a bunch of money, only educated 4 indigenous people, and I'm happy to say now that in the modern day, Harvard is one of the most diverse colleges in the United States, but from very, very humble, terrible beginnings. And I think it's important, say things like that. Another anecdote is we passed by the Wadsworth House earlier. That was actually where four slaves worked at Harvard: Juba, Beulah, Titus, and Venus, who are now commemorated with a plaque as a result of our former president Drew Faust's historical kind of research initiative, trying to figure out more about Harvard's the sides of Harvard's history that we're not particularly proud of, but are nonetheless very important. And so I'm proud to say that, you know, we're now including those things in our tours. But yeah, Harvard, especially here in the Old Yard, is a process of continual learning, continual historical digging. We have a class that meets just meters from where we are now. It's called the Archaeology of Harvard Yard, and every fall you can see a big hole in the middle of where we're like near where we're standing, and they just sift through the dirt that they find, and every year they uncover increasingly interesting artifacts, you know, everything from bricks to pottery and cool stuff like that if you're into archaeology. It's a process of continual learning. In kind of another very historical, and so this is a very historical space, the Old Yard, and perhaps the most historical building in the Old Yard is Massachusetts Hall, which will be the next stop on our tour. I mentioned our president earlier, Drew Faust. Mass Hall is actually where the president of Harvard University works. So, you know, hopefully, if we're lucky, we can catch our president walking out of his front door. But if everyone would walk with me, I'd appreciate that. And does anyone have any questions before we move on? All right, sweet. You guys can ask me questions too about just comp in general. Oh man, I don't have a Mass Hall picture. Shit. One sec. I'm gonna get a Mass Hall picture. All right, one sec. So yeah, if you noticed, I kind of didn't really stick exactly to the script because the first tour stop is just this barrage of historical information. You'll see that throughout the, you know, your time viewing model tours that kind of key people all do this differently. And many key members, kind of not proud to say, you know, forget a lot of the historical information included in the first stop, just because the way that it's structured is kind of like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So for the purpose of comp, I would say include all of the information, but don't worry too much about structuring it any particular way. Just worry about having a cohesive story. So the way that I kind of do it is talking a little bit about, you know, Harvard's history through the lens of how women were integrated into the college. But as long as you hit those bullet points, you could totally talk about some other angle. That's completely cool. Just want people to know that. All right, here we are. Massachusetts Hall, baby. So as I mentioned, you know, Massachusetts Hall is in fact the oldest building at Harvard. It's one of the most historical buildings here at the college. Well, I guess the most historical, and it's where our president works nowadays. However, it has served a variety of roles in its history. It was built in 1720, and so it is now, oh man, actually 300 years old this year. So happy 300th birthday, Massachusetts Hall. And it was recently renovated as well, so kind of a birthday present for our college's oldest building. Being built in 1720 actually makes Mass Hall the second oldest collegiate building in the entire United States. Only second to a building at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And that's generally true, actually, the historical significance of all of the buildings behind me on this side of the yard. You might notice, looking around, that they look a little bit older. They look a little bit more colonial in their architecture. And all of these buildings were built in the 1700s, before America was even a country. And as a result, back when I was talking about, you know, George Washington, every single one of these buildings was actually, at one point in the American Revolutionary War, a barracks for holding troops. And that's one of my favorite stories about Mass Hall that I'll tell you now, is its role in the American Revolutionary War. So let's take ourselves back to 1775. The American Revolutionary War, it's heating up. Everyone's getting a little bit mad about various things the British are doing. It's tense in Boston. And the British, they decide, these Bostonians, they're getting a little bit too rowdy. What we're going to do is we're going to blockade the harbor. And so in 1775, there were a variety of British warships barricading in Boston Harbor, and the Bostonians really didn't like that at all. So who'd they call up? They called up our first eventual president, George Washington. They said, hey man, we're going to need some help. Harvard University was quick to provide some help as well. And what happened was George Washington brought all of his troops here, and Harvard University, as an academic institution, moved to Concord, Massachusetts, around 50 miles to the northwest of here. And all of these buildings ceased to be classrooms, ceased to be dormitories, and became barracks. The building behind me, Mass Hall, actually held 240 Revolutionary soldiers, which is incredible because nowadays only around 12, I think it's 12, definitely get that number right, 12 students live in Massachusetts Hall. And so what happened was these soldiers were so crowded in Mass Hall and so low on basic provisions, basic resources, because they were a pretty ragtag group, that they actually started stripping Mass Hall of all of its important, expensive fixtures. So they took off the doorknobs in Mass Hall, for example. And the doorknobs, of course, are made of brass. What's brass good for? Melting down and making bullets. So these soldiers stripped off all the doorknobs, melted them down, pressed them into bullets, fired them at the British, came back to Harvard, and then kept repeating the cycle. So they melted down all the kitchen appliances, they stripped the cupboards of extra wood for construction, and by the time they were done and the British were finished with their blockade, Mass Hall was basically a shell. They even had horses quartered in the first floor of Mass Hall. So they had 240 guys living on the top 3 floors of the building, which is just egregious. So it was in disrepair. And Harvard University came back and was like, what the hell is going on? And the first actual legal dispute between the newly formed United States of America, once the Revolutionary War ended, and Harvard College was, sorry, I messed that up. The first legal dispute between the newly formed United States and a private entity was the dispute over the damages to Mass Hall between Harvard University and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which I think is really interesting. There's a couple other stories related to kind of where we are right now. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the space, moving generally kind of in the direction in front of me. Mass Hall, as I said, had soldiers living here. And to say that this area is a residential area is definitely, and has always been a residential area, is definitely true. That holds for the present day. In the modern day, around 1,400 of the college's 1,600 undergraduates in their first year, or freshmen, as we sometimes say, live here. The around 250 that don't live in the yard are relegated to the union dorms, as we call them, which are a terrible 5-minute walk in that direction. And everyone complains about being so far away in the union dorms, but it's not very, stressful or bad at all. I think people just generally want to be right in the middle of everything in Harvard Yard, and I don't blame them because it's such a beautiful area. I personally lived actually on the corner of Matthews Hall, right in that room, right on the back corner. And this was a really interesting place for me to live because we had a big speaker system, and what would happen was when we threw parties, which of course really infrequently happened because I'm a very studious Harvard student, the sound would bounce in between Matthews Hall and Massachusetts Hall, which wasn't that big of a problem, except for when you consider that the president of Harvard University's office was directly across from my room. So I had to be kind of careful about when I was throwing parties because our president, Lawrence Bacow, or when I was a freshman, our president, Drew Faust, was actually working. So, I was just crossing my fingers that Drew Faust wasn't putting in some late night work at like 11:30 p.m. when we started our parties. But, we kind of flew under the radar. Drew was all right with letting us have a little bit of fun, and we worked out a nice, work-life balance. But it was a real blast living there, and I had to watch my noise level, but not as much as the 15 or so students who actually live, surprisingly, on the top floor of the building right behind me, Massachusetts Hall. These students are, mysterious to say the least, because it's hard to find them. Some people say that the students who are selected to live in Mass Hall are chosen, as a result of how quiet they put themselves down on the housing form. Other people will say they're chosen randomly. I'd say that it's probably more of the latter, because I've known a couple of musicians who've lived in Mass Hall who are definitely not quiet. So I think it's just random. And if you live in Mass Hall, it's actually really cool. You get to eat a dinner with the president of Harvard University at least once throughout the year. And that's just one example of like cool things that happen at Harvard that I don't think happen anywhere else. Like living in the same building that your president is working in right below you, having that kind of exposure, that kind of personal connection is really cool. And so this residential area, is filled with freshman dorms. There are a couple buildings that aren't dormitories, however. Normally in my tour, I would ask the tour group, what buildings are those? But you all know, so I'll skip over that. So I'll just assume that people have asked. So that's University Hall over there, the white marble building. It's a spectacular building. It serves a little bit less spectacular purpose. It's the kind of the administrative hub of Harvard University. It is where all of the undergraduate administrative work kind of gets done. And infamously, there is a board, an administrative board there called the Ad Board that handles all discipline for the college. And so, of course, being the stellar person, stellar student I am, I've never been inside University Hall, but usually when undergrads are called inside there, it's to meet with the Ad Board to discuss disciplinary action against them. I, of course, have a clean record, so I don't know too much about the Ad Board. And I'm not eager to venture inside University Hall that much, but I'm sure there's some cool stuff in there. Once I was telling that joke to a tour group that I knew was like administrative workers from Harvard, but I wasn't like sure what school, and they ended up being the Ad Board. So I once like actually gave a joke to the Ad Board, and they were like, bro, come on, like you say this on every one of your tours. And I was like, yeah. But so anyways, that's University Hall. It's all administrative offices, so people aren't living in there. And then if you look to my or to your right, you can see Harvard Hall, which is a very interesting building that has a lot of very interesting history behind it. And so Harvard Hall was originally one of the oldest buildings on Harvard's campus. It was built all the way back in 1642, but Harvard Hall is perhaps one of the spookiest, one of the most scary buildings for its dark and twisted history that I will now recount for you, filled with intrigue and tragedy. So Harvard Hall, built originally in 1642. This was back when Harvard was like two buildings, right? So they built it very poorly. It did not hold up to the harsh New England winters. And actually, Harvard Hall rotted at its foundation. And less than 30 years later, it had to be rebuilt in the 1670s. But this iteration of Harvard Hall, though it was built sturdily, did not last either. And it lasted, in fact, until 1764. And in 1764, something terrible happened, perhaps the most tragic thing to ever happen in our college's long and storied history. And I will take you into that terrible night, the night of January 24th, 1764. It was cold outside. It was snowing. In fact, it was a blizzard. And there were a lot of people trying to escape this blizzard. These people weren't just normal Harvard College students. No, it was the entire general legislature for the colony of Massachusetts. And, these were like the political decision makers who were all in Harvard Hall. Of course, these people wouldn't normally be in Harvard Hall. They would be downtown Boston, where they would work at the old State House. But they were at Harvard Hall for a very particular reason. And that was because in downtown Boston, there was a smallpox epidemic that was raging, and they needed to get away from disease. So what did they do? They packed themselves in a crowded Harvard Hall in the middle of winter. Perhaps not what we would think of as social distancing in the modern day, but they were trying their best. And fortunately, to my knowledge, none of them got sick. However, perhaps something even worse befell them, because in that dark and stormy night, they were trying to warm up, they were trying to heat Harvard Hall, and so they had a lot of candles and lamps going, and one of these legislators knocked over one of the lamps, and it's unclear exactly what happened, but that night Harvard Hall burnt to the ground, and it was a terrible tragedy, not for a loss of human life. Actually, no one died. Everyone was able to get out in time, but because Harvard Hall was named Harvard Hall because every single one of John Harvard's books and scientific instruments that he gave Harvard University was located in Harvard Hall. In 1764, Harvard Hall was the sole library of Harvard University. And so when it burnt down, we lost all of our books, including over 400 books that John Harvard gave us. So his original donation to the school, his original legacy, was completely burnt to a crisp. And they thought, in fact, that they lost every single one of these books. But there was one book that survived. And it was a little bit of light reading entitled The Christian Warfare Against the Devil, World, and Flesh. It was written, I believe, by John Donne, and it was checked out by a delinquent student. His name was Ephraim Briggs. Ephraim Briggs, subpar Harvard College student. This dude, he was a slow reader because he checked out The Christian Warfare Against the Devil, World, and Flesh back in mid-October of 1763. By January of 1764, this man was way overdue on his 3-week library lease, which was the duration of library leases at the time. Normally, the penalty for violating a library lease back in the 1700s for Harvard College would be a severe fine or expulsion. But Ephraim Briggs had this one book that survived. And so the way I'd like to imagine it is the librarians are, parsing over the ashes of Harvard Hall. They find a library receipt saying there's one book checked out, and it's Ephraim Briggs who has it. They went to Ephraim Briggs, and they asked him, like, man, do you have this book? And he actually had it, and they gave it back to him. So as a result, he wasn't fined, he wasn't suspended, and that book still lives on to this day in Harvard's Rare Book Library, which is Houghton Library. We'll pass by it later on our tour, and although that book isn't available for the public to look at, we have a variety of public exhibitions in Houghton Library that are always a blast to check out, and those librarians are some of the best we have at the college because they are looking at the rarest manuscripts that one of the best library collections in the whole world has. I encourage you to interact with them later. Let's see how we're doing on time, guys. Ooh, shit, I've been talking a lot. So I'll include a couple more stories, or like one or two more stories, just because I want to give you a kind of exhaustive overview of this stop. And Mass Hall, kind of a pro tip, is like a stop where you can just go ballistic on anecdotes, because there's just so much you can talk about. The Revolutionary War, Harvard Hall, you can talk about the guardhouse that costs an absurd amount of money. You talk about Johnson Gate. You can talk about protests at University Hall if you want. It's a good time to talk about that sort of thing as well. I'll talk about Johnson Gate a little bit. So this gate behind me, Johnson Gate, it was constructed in 1890. I could bore you with architectural details, but I won't because I think they're not important. What is more important for Johnson Gate is that it's a very superstitious, spooky place on campus. And that's because a lot of Harvard undergraduates will tell you that you're only supposed to pass underneath it twice, or else terrible tragedy, bad grades, and eventual dropout will afflict you. And so these 2 days, these 2 times when you're supposed to pass underneath Johnson Gate are when you first enter the college on move-in day, and of course, when you graduate, you're supposed to pass underneath the gate ceremonially, and I don't know, perhaps leave Harvard forever. I'm not sure what they're trying to get at with that sort of myth, but you're never supposed to return, at least through Johnson Gate. And I wish I knew this when I came to Harvard because I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I live at the end of the Orange Line, and so when I was supposed to move into Harvard, I was doing an orientation program called the First Year Orientation Program, or FOP. And basically they just stick a bunch of kids in the wilderness with some Harvard College students. You talk about, everything from your feelings to like how you like the outdoors for a week, and it was an incredible experience. But my parents, they were like, dude, like, here's a backpack, just get yourself to Harvard Square. And so they stuck me on the MBTA, the subway, and I actually entered Harvard College for the first time through the same gate that we went in, because it's the gate that's closest to the subway stop. And so the first thing I heard when I entered Harvard College, obviously as a freshman, because I had all these bags with me, was, man, you just really screwed up. And I was like, oh, geez, what I do? And apparently, you're not supposed to pass underneath any other gate, but I'm actively working to reverse the curse. Check back with me in about a year. If this global pandemic subsides, you will catch me in Tercentenary Theater receiving my diploma. Fingers crossed. And hopefully I will beat that curse. But anyways, that's about it for this stop. As I said, we're in a very residential area where literally 1,000+ college students are living. Our next stop over by the Science Center Plaza is a much less residential area. It's got much more of an academic feel. And I'll be talking a little bit more about Harvard's academics over there. But before we go, does anyone have any questions? All right, sweet, sweet, sweet. Let me change my background. Hope everyone's liking these backgrounds. I curated them specifically for this tour. So yeah, go crazy on stories for Mass Hall. We all love hearing kind of whatever you can dig up. There's a lot of cool stuff. In terms of finding research, while I pull up this extra background, one of my favorite ways to find stuff is through really old Crimson articles or like Harvard Gazette articles, because they have records going back like at least 130 years. And so sometimes you can just Google random stuff and it will come up like cool articles about Harvard's history from the perspective of like that history itself. Before we get to the Science Center Plaza, sometimes when you're walking over there, you pass by Holden Chapel. This is another cool way another cool example of things that you can work in on your tour as you like walk from one area to the next. It'll be a little bit harder to do this virtually, but I just wanted to give an example of like some way you could go above and beyond perhaps on your tour. So Holden Chapel is it's great. Sometimes we give these Halloween tours for Key where we're talking exclusively about spooky stories. So coming right off of the Harvard Hall spooky stories, I'll go to Holden Chapel and talk about how Holden Chapel has served many purposes throughout its time at Harvard as one of the oldest buildings here, but actually it was originally built to hold cadavers for medical dissection. And so it was originally holding dead bodies for the medical students at Harvard. Nowadays it holds, of course, instruments because a lot of bands practice there. So long and storied history of Holden Chapel. There's also a really interesting story that I sometimes tell that I won't recount now just because we're kind of short on time. But it's the story of how forensic anthropology began in the United States, like the field of forensic anthropology. And it was this Harvard professor called John Webster who basically like killed this dude and threw his body in like the garbage chute of a Harvard College office building. And they ended up using like science to determine that he ended up committing the crime and burning this dude's body. It's a psycho story. But the guy's name's John Webster. Other people, the guy he killed was George Parkman. And the person who figured everything out was Ephraim Littlefield. That's Eprahim Littlefield. And so if you Google those three names, you'll probably figure out the story or find it. It's a sick story. Harvard has a ton of stories like it. I encourage you to find those. So we'll go to the Science Center now. So now we're at the Science Center. The way that I like to think about the Science Center, we exited a very residential area. Science Center, of course, looks completely different than where we were. It's got more of an academic field, but where we're standing right now, the Science Center Plaza, I think is kind of the heart of it all. Behind us, we have all academic buildings. The Science Center looms above us. We have the engineering buildings behind the Science Center. Before us, where we came from, we have all of these residential buildings. And then in the Science Center Plaza itself, you can see people on good days, like good weather days, relaxing, chilling, getting food from food trucks, just hanging out. And so the Science Center Plaza is kind of where the academics, the residential life, and the social life just comes together in a really cool way at Harvard. Even though it might not be the most beautiful spot on campus, it's definitely the spot to see and be seen. So I like to chill here sometimes. And it's a really interesting place, of course, dominated by the Harvard Science Center. In the interest of time, guys, I won't go through all of the things that Science Center has. So talk about Science Center. And so, and then talk about like Harvard's classes, like the number of classes, all of the things that are on the tour outline that are just kind of like you're spitting, like rote facts. And so Harvard has what's called liberal arts education philosophy, and it follows a lot of colleges in the United States that are liberal arts colleges. Does anyone want to venture a guess or like try to define what liberal arts education is?
You learn a little bit about everything.
That's great. Thank you, Amy. And that's totally correct. You know, I did see a lot of blank faces though, which I don't think is a bad thing. You know, as Amy said, you learn a little bit about everything with the liberal arts education. And so that means liberal arts is kind of purposefully confusing. It does kind of prompt blank stares because liberal arts, it's broad. Liberal arts is this educational philosophy that emphasizes learning a little bit about everything, dipping your toes in a lot of different subject matter and figuring out what you want and then kind of pursuing that in a more meaningful way. And so at Harvard College, the way this works is we have this general education system. You have to take 8 different classes in 8 different fields by the time you graduate. And these fields are completely different. They range from quantitative reasoning to moral or aesthetics and interpretive understanding. I'm a little bit like confused, guys, on the gen ed system just because like I'm grandfathered in, so I finished all of mine, so I'm not, you know, up to speed on the structure, but you should know it for your evaluations. But anyways, you study 8 different subjects, and this is kind of to give you a broad understanding of the different things that are taught at Harvard College. But of course, every student does have their major. And when I came to Harvard College, I actually thought I wanted to be an economics major. And I took a couple classes in economics, and no disrespect to anyone who's studying economics, which sometimes seems to be like half of Harvard, but it just wasn't for me. I didn't like it. I didn't find it engaging. And so I was lost my first year, and I thought, you know, what am I going to do? And on a whim, I took this class. It was a freshman seminar, the freshman seminar program is an extraordinary opportunity for first-year Harvard College students to take classes in a variety of different subject matter. And so this freshman seminar counted for a gen ed. It was also a freshman seminar. It was held in the Harvard Forest. And so every weekend I would go out to the Harvard Forest and I would collect botanical specimens and research them and do a lot of field work. And I loved it. And it made me immediately switch my focus to organismic and evolutionary biology and environmental science, which is what I study today. And if I didn't have that flexibility afforded by the gen ed system, I would have never had the opportunity to switch from economics. And maybe I would end my Harvard College experience as, you know, a disaffected economist. And that would have been so much worse than, for me personally, than what I'm doing now, which is basically looking at plants all day. And I love it. But yeah, to talk a little bit more personally, because we've been speaking a lot about academics, just one story about the Science Center, this building behind us, that I really enjoy and like telling is, you know, it's kind of related to extracurriculars here at Harvard. We have a lot of different clubs at Harvard, over 450 of them, and there are a lot that interface more broadly with the world and the Cambridge community and different organizations. One of these is the Harvard College in Asia program, which brings in students from different universities in Asia. And so I participated that for my first 2 years at Harvard. And the first year, I was with a bunch of students from Ewha Women's University in Korea, and they came over to Harvard during winter break, and I took them up to the top of the Science Center, where, as you can see, we have astrological observatory. So there's a really powerful telescope. You go out on the balcony, and we went on the balcony on the 8th floor of the Science Center, and we were just looking at the stars for a really long time. And I thought it was a pretty mundane experience because, you know, you can't see too many stars in Boston. But for a lot of these students who had grown up in the middle of Seoul, they had never really seen stars at all before. So everyone was marveling by the number of stars in the Boston sky. And I was like, what? You know, like there's no stars here. But it was cool nonetheless. And it gave me this interesting perspective about how other people and other college students experience life in different areas of the world. And I think that's true at Harvard, not only in the extracurricular experiences people have, but also in the student body. We have so many people from so many different places, and it's a continual learning experience, not just educationally. So I always like saying that story. One more story that I like telling is the story of this awkward building we have over there in the middle of the intersection. That's the Cambridge City Fire Department, and it looks a lot like a Harvard College dormitory rather than a fire station. Although if you look through those doors, you can see the fire engines that are idle right now. And you may ask yourself, why does this fire station look like a neo-colonial building, and why does it look like a Harvard dorm? That seems extra and unnecessary. And you would be correct. It is extra and unnecessary. And as you go through the tour, you'll notice that a lot of things here at Harvard are. And this is because it looks like a Harvard dorm because it was designed to look like a Harvard dorm. Back in the 1930s, there was no fire station at Harvard. And as we know from what happened in 1764, fires are a problem at Harvard, and the city of Cambridge told Harvard University, we're mandating that you have, you know, a fire station within a certain distance from campus. And so Harvard College actually donated the land on which this fire station now exists to the city of Cambridge so that they could build a fire station to be used mainly for fires at Harvard. And the one kind of requirement that Harvard University had was that it looked like a Harvard dormitory so that it wouldn't stick out. Nowadays, I would say it kind of sticks out because it's wedged basically in between the Science Center, which looks anything but like a Harvard dorm, and Candidate Hall, which is over there. That looks a little bit more like a prison than a Harvard dormitory in the classical sense. We'll explain that a little bit more later, but it does stick out, but in a beautiful way. And even buildings like the Science Center, I would like to say, are beautiful in their own manner. Anyways, Harvard was very lucky to have built this fire station because in 1956, this building over here, Memorial Hall, the large building, it almost entirely burnt down. I actually heard this story from someone who witnessed this fire firsthand. One of my first professors at Harvard, he taught a class called You and Your Camera, which was the physics of photography. So he was this old physics nerd. He was like 84 years old, I believe. And he was entering his first day of graduate studies in the physics department at Harvard on the day this fire happened. It was September in 1954. And so this guy had rolled out of bed in the morning and was walking across the Science Center Plaza where we are to go get food because Memorial Hall is partially a dining hall where students could eat. And he realized that his dining hall was on fire. The entire clock tower was burning down. And instead of running away from the fire like a normal, reasonable person would do, this guy, who would later go on to become a world-renowned physics professor, ran towards the fire because he had to talk to the firemen because according to the laws of fluid dynamics, they were fighting this fire entirely wrong. You see, the firemen, they couldn't reach the top of the tower with their hoses. And they figured that this is just because they didn't have a long enough ladder. So there were these firemen bringing hoses up on this big ladder, and the water was just topping out right below where the fire was. And my professor, he explained to the firemen that, no, you've got it all wrong. You need to increase the water pressure in the tanks that hold the water if you want it to reach a higher height. Duh. If you know anything about fluid dynamics, this would be evident to you. Unfortunately, the firemen didn't know, and I for sure, sitting in the class, had no idea what he's talking about, and still to this day really have no clue. And so Memorial Hall, the tower, actually burnt down to where they could reach it with hoses. Fortunately for us, it's been restored so the tower appears as it normally would have when it was first built, but unfortunately it actually doesn't have a clock anymore. It once had a really cool clock. But Memorial Hall is going to be our next stop on the tour. We'll learn a little bit more about the building's long and storied history as we walk across and by Memorial Hall. Try to get a look at the building and get a feel for what you think the original purpose of Memorial Hall was. So we'll go there now. I'm gonna switch my background. So imagine us walking by this spectacular building, Memorial Hall, and we find ourselves in the Memorial Hall transept. Everyone is very impressed by the stained glass. All tourists are always like, "Oh my God!" But does anyone want to guess what the original purpose of Memorial Hall was? Shy group today. Somebody say something.
Was it an alumni events space?
Okay, yes, it was. But, okay. Normally tourists go, wow, this looks like a cathedral. And so I'll assume you said that because that's how my tour is structured. Tourists are very predictable with what they say, just by the way. So yeah, it looks a lot like a cathedral because it actually is designed in the style of a cathedral. However, the really cool thing about Memorial Hall is that it has been, since it was constructed, entirely secular. This building never served a religious purpose. And so where we are standing now in the transept of Memorial Hall is actually in a cathedral. The transept would be where the altar is. Like it was the heart of the cathedral, the most important part of the cathedral. And similarly, Memorial Hall, the transept of Memorial Hall is the most important part of Memorial Hall. And that's because if you look to your left and your right, there are marble plaques on the wall. And these plaques read out the names of the 137 Harvard affiliates and students who died fighting for the Union Army in the American Civil War. And that's the purpose of Memorial Hall. That is the memorial of Memorial Hall. Memorial Hall was built between 1872 and 1878 by Harvard College graduates whose dear friends had been killed in the Civil War. And they donated a reasonable sum of money towards the construction of this building so those people would never be forgotten. They're, of course, memorialized forever in this beautiful space. And I think it's a wonderful way to just remember the people who died fighting, not only for the abolition of slavery, but for, you know, the continuing existence of our country. And I think it's a really cool space. A lot of people always ask me, you know, these are only Union soldiers represented here on the wall. What's up with the Confederate soldiers? Well, as one might imagine, soldiers fighting for the South, memorializing them would have been very controversial for a university located firmly in the north of the United States. And that was true. A lot of Harvard College administrators and other people involved had a problem with including those Confederate names. So they struck a compromise, and now those Confederate names are located in the Harvard Club of Texas in Austin, which is important. You know, though those soldiers did die fighting for morally reprehensible values, they nonetheless did die in battle. And for whatever that's worth, I think it's worth remembering them. So if you're at all interested in those people, you can find them down south in the Harvard Club of Texas in Austin. But speaking a little bit more broadly about Memorial Hall, it's divided into three parts. To our right is Annenberg Hall, which is where freshmen eat their meals. Unfortunately, we can't go inside. However, I can't even go inside because it's reserved exclusively for freshmen. I realize I'm like super over on time, so I'm definitely gonna skip talking about Annenberg Hall. I'll also kind of skip talking about Sanders Theater. Basically, all you need to know is what's on the fact sheet. If you want to talk about student performances, you can talk about those as well. And the way that I transition from Sanders Theater to Tercentenary Theater is talking about the graduation activities. So as I've said, Sanders Theater was originally the place where we had our commencement activities at Harvard, but as a 1,200 seat lecture auditorium, Sanders Theater, of course, can't accommodate all of the students who are graduating because nowadays Harvard has like 1,600, 1,700 students per class. So it couldn't even hold the students, let alone all of the visitors. So we've had to transition over our graduation activities to Tercentenary Theater, which is our next stop on the tour. And it can hold over 10 times the number of people that Sanders Theater can hold. All right, so we'll go to Tercentenary Theater. So here we are in Tercentenary Theater. Right behind me, you can see Memorial Church. Memorial Church is a really cool place on campus. And imagine, for the purpose of this tour, guys, that we're standing right underneath Memorial Church, kind of like on that granite pavilion. And so Tercentenary Theater is called Tercentenary Theater. It's kind of a complicated name, but it's called that because what we're standing on right now is actually the stage of Tercentenary Theater. And it's called the stage because Harvard's graduation activities occur all throughout the green space before us. And so all of the most important people, the guest speakers, the administrators, the honored guests of the graduation activities are sitting up here where we are in big fancy chairs, looking out on the audience of over 20,000 people that gather every May, with the exception of this May, to witness Harvard's graduation. And it's a really, really wonderful time here at the college. And I'll talk about my first experience with graduation, or commencement as we call it here at Harvard. So I was back in, I believe, 8th grade in grade school, and my school required me to do community service. And so in order to graduate. And so I was in a school that, it was a Boston public school that ran from 7th to 12th grade. And so I wanted to get like a little bit of a head start on this community service requirement. And so I was looking for things to do, and they had posted that one available activity was volunteering at Harvard's commencement. And I was like, oh man, I got to do this. Not because I was actually interested in Harvard University at all, but because the commencement, of course, occurs on a weekday. So I'd be able to skip school for the day. So I was super stoked about that, because it was like 3 hours of hard work in the morning, and then you just get to like skate for the rest of the day, and you can just do whatever you want. So I was super excited. I signed up. And the guest speaker that year was Mark Zuckerberg. So I was like, I like Facebook. Maybe I'll stick around to hear Mark Zuckerberg talk. Like, this will be super chill. So I was an usher. So I had to show everybody to their seats. And immediately I realized it was way less chill than I had anticipated it being, because there were over 25,000 people gathered for commencement. And so if you can imagine looking out on this green space, every single available patch of grass, sorry guys, let me mute myself, guys. Every available patch of grass being occupied by visitors and those graduating. Even in the old yard where we started our tour, you can't even see the stage over there. And what they do is they actually hang flat screen TVs and project they live stream the commencement activities for everyone that can't see it but is like nearby. It's absurd. So I had to show all of these people with a small team of other people from my high school where to sit. And it was one of the most stressful experiences of my entire life. But actually, thankfully, very quickly, as people got seated, that stress melted away entirely, because I began to realize how special of a time it is. You have people from all different walks of life, from all over the world, convening on one location to celebrate, unanimously, this long, hard 4 years that has been filled with learning, has been filled with life experiences, has in many ways been the hardest years of one's life, but has in many ways been the best years. And so it's just this extremely unique emotional atmosphere that I've never experienced since, and I hope to experience in 1 year when hopefully I graduate. And it was just incredible seeing that as such a young person. And it was the first moment, I don't want to get too sappy here, but the first moment that I began to consider, hey, maybe I should perhaps, maybe I should apply to Harvard. I didn't think I was going to get in by any means, but here I am today. And if I am able to successfully reverse the curse that we talked about back at Johnson Gate, catch me next May, graduating from Harvard in this very location. And so hopefully that'll happen. Normally at the stop, I'd also talk about Memorial Church, kind of the basic things that you can imagine. I talk about Seaver Hall, Emerson Hall, very briefly. Seaver Hall is a good place to talk about extracurriculars if you want to wrap that in there, because clubs meet sometimes in those rooms in Seaver Hall. One kind of personal story I give is about Robinson Hall, the history department, which is right behind over there, right behind Memorial Church. So I'll give that anecdote, which is like just one thing that I've kind of garnered. Okay, so back there, I've talked about the other academic buildings in the space. Robinson Hall is the seat of the history department, and I study trees, and I also love history, so I'm all about the history of trees. And so one of the coolest things that I've learned about the trees of Harvard Yard, which are numerous and all very special, is that those trees in front of Robinson Hall, the history department, are perhaps the most historic trees on Harvard's campus. They're dawn redwoods, and the reason I say they're the most historic trees on Harvard's campus, and you know what, I'll go even further. I think those are the most historic trees in the entire world. And this is the reason. Those trees were discovered, that species was discovered by Harvard researchers who were working in central China in the 1940s. And they discovered these trees just growing in a little like marshy area, and they were immediately thrilled. And the reason they were thrilled is because these dawn redwoods, or metasequoia as they're called, are very well known to scientists, but they aren't very well known to plant biologists. They're very well known to paleobotanists, because this species of plant is widely understood and studied not as a living specimen, but rather as a fossil. There are entire fossil forests of metasequoia actually in North Dakota in the United States. And so they were like, holy crap, we found a living fossil that we thought had gone extinct 80 million years ago, just thriving in central China. They brought a couple of these plants, these little tiny saplings, back to Harvard. And these trees that you can see in front of Robinson Hall today are the first trees of this genus to be brought back to North America after around 72 million years of being extinct on this continent. So I think they're the most historic trees. They're really cool. I'd encourage you to check them out. And I love trees, so I love telling that story. So sorry if I bored you for any non-tree lovers here, but I always got to tell that. And so, as you could see, this stop has had a much more academic aura than our previous, stop in the old yard. Tercentenary Theater filled with academic buildings. And perhaps the most important academic building, perhaps the most important building period on Harvard's campus, is right across from us. It's the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library. It's that magnificent, enormous building right across. And I'll be talking a little bit more about its history on our next stop. I realize I'm kind of running. I probably am I'm at just an hour right now, guys. So if you need to, log off and eat dinner or whatever, feel free. I'll probably take about 15 more minutes to wrap this tour up. Would love to see you stay, but obviously if you gotta go, you gotta go. But we'll launch into Widener Library now. So Widener Library, So Widener Library is named after Harry Elkins Widener. You can see up there, Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library, completed in MDCC. I don't know. I would read it out normally, the Latin letters. And these Latin letters are very important because actually it was completed in, as it says in Latin, 1914. I used to say that it was completed in 1916, but it was a really embarrassing moment on one of my tours where I used to not actually read what was up there. So there was one dude who was reading the stones, and he was like, "What are you doing, man? Like, you're lying to us. It wasn't built in 1916. It was built in 1914, duh." And I got really embarrassed. So I always make sure now. So as I've said, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library. It's named after a very special man, Harry Elkins Widener. He's actually a student at Harvard University. He graduated in 1907 with a degree in literature, and Harry loved books, kind of predictably. He was a bibliophile. And also kind of, fortunately for Harry, his family was one of the richest families in the entire United States. I'm talking boatloads of money. The Widener family was super duper rich. And when you have someone who loves rare books, rare expensive books so much, and has a lot of money to just toss around, what do? You go straight to where all the rare books are. That's Europe, baby. So after graduation in 1907, Harry actually spent 5 years touring throughout continental Europe, looking for rare manuscripts and books with the goal eventually of creating his own library. And so he went all throughout Europe and collected, actually very famously, some first editions of Sir Francis Bacon essays. And these essays were nowhere to be found elsewhere in the world. Only one copy existed of these essays, and those were like his prized possession. And so he was so enthralled collecting all of these books, kind of being floated by his parents' money for 5 years, that his parents started to get a little bit, frustrated with him because he didn't want to go back to the United States. And his dad was getting kind of old. His dad wanted Harry to take over the family business. And I know if, I ran off to Europe for 5 years after graduation, my parents would probably disown me. Harry's parents, they were a little bit more nice. And so what they did was they went, yo, Harry, it's time to come home. But what we'll do first is we'll go on a nice family vacation in Europe. So they went on a family vacation. That was in the winter of 1912, going into, I believe, 1913. And so they toured all throughout Europe for a period of like 4 months, and they collected, they did nice family activities like collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of books, and they were just chilling. But they decided eventually it's time to go home. And the Widener family, they weren't going to spare any expense going home. We're talking, it's around 1912, the year 1912. There's no, Concorde jet. There's no private jets available. So the only and the best way to get across the Atlantic Ocean was, of course, by boat. And the Widener family, they were very picky about what kind of boat they wanted. They wanted a safe boat because they didn't want to drown or anything like that. And they didn't want to get their books wet. These books were worth a ridiculous amount of money. They also wanted a really luxurious boat because they were rich. They wanted to be able to just chill and ball out for a couple weeks because it was a long journey. And so fortunately, or unfortunately for them, there was a very special boat that had just been constructed. This boat, people were saying, not only was it the safest boat ever constructed by humans, many were saying it was unsinkable. It was also, coincidentally, the most luxurious boat ever built by humans. So when the Widener family realized that the Titanic would be making its maiden voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to New York City, they decided, we're going to buy some tickets on the Titanic. And I'm sure you all know what happened to the Titanic. It struck an iceberg tragically in the northern Atlantic Ocean, and it famously sunk. And Harry's family, his mother, his father, and a porter that they had brought with them were all on the Titanic when this happened. And so Harry Elkins Widener, the story goes that, they were rich so they could pay for one of these lifeboats. And so they had a spot on the lifeboats, and the story goes that Harry, his father, and his mother, and this porter were actually rushed to the lifeboat and were on it when Harry realized that he had forgotten in his cabin these Francis Bacon essays. Now, I'm not sure how a large ship sinks, but, based on my watching of the movie The Titanic, it's relatively slowly. So Harry realized or thought that he could actually go from the lifeboat back onto the Titanic and try and grab these books from his cabin. And so he did. His father, the porter, and him, they rushed off the lifeboat to go back onto the Titanic, and they were never heard from again. They all drowned, and it was a terrible tragedy. Harry's mother, Eleanor Widener, ended up going back to the United States alone, and stricken with grief, she was trying to figure out how she could honor her son. And as someone who loved books so much, she decided that a library would be appropriate. So she actually donated back in 1912 or 1914, I believe, $3 million for the construction, or maybe 2 million, I don't know, you guys know better than me, for the construction of Widener Library, which is an enormous sum of money today and an even more enormous sum of money back in the early 1900s. And Eleanor Widener, she pulled a couple strings to make this happen, because where we are today at Widener Library, was in those times the location of another very famous building at Harvard called Gore Hall, which was a beautiful old building that was used by undergraduates, and it was named after, presumably, an old rich white man named Gore who died and left a lot of money to the college. And so Eleanor Widener swoops in. She is trying to name a big building after another old, or not old, but rich white man who had a lot of money. And she thinks, wait a minute, I need to make sure that they just don't demolish the Widener Library, my Widener Library, like they demolished Gore Hall, because the plans that were carried out were to demolish Gore Hall to make room for Widener Library. Eleanor didn't want this to happen, so she bargained with the university extensively. And she got the university to agree to a couple stipulations, the most important of which is that no brick, stone, or mortar on the exterior of Widener Library can be at all changed in its design. And so the library that you see here today is exactly the same in its outside appearance as it would have appeared when it was finished in its construction over 100 years ago. And it will remain that way for as long as Harvard University exists. And so if Harvard in any way violates the stipulation, all of the books in Widener Library are then turned over to the city of Cambridge. So Harvard has remained true to the promise. And this presents a really interesting problem for Harvard because, as you might imagine, we're always trying to collect more books, and Widener Library contains literally millions of books. But in the 100 years since the library has been completed, we've significantly expanded our library system. But we can't really build up, can we? Because we can't change the exterior appearance of the library. So what are we forced to do? Well, we've built down. We've dug out 5 basement sublevels of Widener Library that extend from the library all the way over to my left to other libraries. You can see Houghton Library over there. And so there's an extensive underground network of what we call the stacks that goes from this library all the way to Houghton and extends most of the way to Memorial Church, actually, through Tercentenary Theater, where we're standing now. So underneath all of our feet is 5 sublevels filled with books. It's a very scary place. There's no cellular service. There's little Wi-Fi available. So if you want to study very intensely and not have any distractions, I recommend you go into the stacks. And if you want to, run 2 marathons worth of books in the stacks, you can, because Widener Library contains over 56 miles of bookshelves. And so that just gives you a feel for how extensive these stacks are. And so that's how we've cleverly worked around Eleanor's stipulation. However, we haven't really worked around her second stipulation, which was that she wanted an exact replica of her son Harry's study to be constructed in the middle of Widener Library. And so if you go to the heart of Widener Library, which unfortunately we can't do today because Widener Library isn't open to the public, you'll see an exact replica of Harry's study. It's a beautiful oak paneled room, and there's a big looming portrait of Harry that it dominates the room. There are a variety of rare books, and then every day the librarians of Widener Library replace a fresh bouquet of flowers at Harry's desk, and that allows us to keep our memory of Harry, I would say, fresh in our mind. And that kind of captures Harvard's sentiment towards our generous alumni who have not only benefited our university through generous donations of buildings and money, but also not their contributions to scientific and literary and other fields, their contributions to things like athletics. We've had a lot of Olympians come through Harvard, and their contributions to, society at large, politically and otherwise. And so I think it's always important when we talk about Harry Elkins Widener and our generous alumni to go back to the man who started it all, John Harvard, our first donor. And so to end our tour, we'll be going to the John Harvard statue. And does anyone have any questions before we head over there? So yeah, sweet. We'll go over there just to talk a little bit about other things you could include at your Widener Library stop. If you want to talk about the Gutenberg Bible, that's a sweet story. Many of you are probably aware that in 1967, there was a dude who tried to steal the Gutenberg Bible. I encourage you to look up that story because it's it's really hysterical. Like, this dude was actually legitimately insane and hid in a bathroom on like the 3rd floor of Widener Library, and just like almost fell to his death trying to carry these huge Gutenberg Bible volumes out of the library through the interior courtyard. Another interesting detail is that I talked a little bit about, obviously Eleanor Widener's stipulation that Widener Library can remain unchanged. The one place where we've actually not stayed true to that promise is if you walk into Widener and you're like on the landing, right where you can walk and see Harry's study. If you look to your left and your right, there are those study rooms that they have those huge ceilings, and there's glass over the top. And so those actually originally were interior courtyards that didn't have a roof. And after the dude tried to climb his way up through that courtyard to the roof of Widener Library, they covered it with glass. So that story is actually tied, interestingly enough, to Eleanor Widener's stipulation. So it's a cool story to mention, that if I had more time, I'd probably talk about. All right, on to the John Harvard statue. Also, that transition between Widener and John Harvard is like my most proud transition. I'm like super stoked about that one. I like it a lot. I made it myself, so I'm like, yeah, tooting my own horn. So let me stop bragging. Whew. All right, home stretch, people. Let's get it. So here we are at the John Harvard statue. Actually, before we start, for my tour, I actually go around to the far side of the John Harvard statue, and I stand on the first step of those stairs in front of University Hall. And that's so I can get a look at the side of the statue. And the side of the statue has a plaque on it, like a crest of Harvard University, if you all are familiar with that. I just wanted to explain that now because it's going to factor into this tour stop, and you wouldn't really be able to understand unless I gave you kind of a visual description. So here we are at the John Harvard statue. The John Harvard statue, as you can see right now, people are taking pictures right in front of it. And the John Harvard statue is, in fact, the 3rd most photographed statue in the entire United States. Does anyone want to guess at what the other most photographed statues are in the U.S.?
Statue of Liberty.
Okay, I've heard a couple people saying the Statue of Liberty. That is for sure the 1st most photographed statue.
The Jefferson Memorial.
Wrong, actually. But
the Lincoln
guess.
Memorial.
The Lincoln Memorial is correct. So the Lincoln Memorial, it goes in this order, right? The Statue of Liberty, the Lincoln Memorial, John Harvard statue. If anyone's familiar, actually, with the way that the Lincoln Memorial looks, it's pretty similar to the John Harvard statue. Similar, handsome looking old white dude seated in a big chair with a book on his lap. This is actually not a coincidence, because the Lincoln Memorial and the John Harvard statue were designed by the same man. His name was Daniel Chester French, and he was a pretty important sculptor in the late 1800s in American history. He designed this statue, I believe, in 1872, and he included an inscription right on the front, which reads, if you can see it, John Harvard, founder, 1638. And Daniel Chester French, this man, he was a spectacular sculptor. He was a terrible historian, because that inscription, that small inscription, is filled with lies, 3 of them, in fact. And so the statue is colloquially called the Statue of 3 Lies here at Harvard. Does anyone know what those lies are? All right, you in the back. Oh, okay. Earlier in your tour, you said that, Harvard wasn't founded in 1638. Yeah, you're completely right. Harvard was actually founded in 1636 by members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that actually alludes to the second lie, which is that John Harvard was, in fact, not the founder of Harvard University. It was founded by the Mass Bay Colony. It's called Harvard, though, as I said, because he donated a lot of stuff and really got us on our feet as a university. But the third lie which by the way, guys, like tourists don't know this lie, so you can usually build it up like super, you can get people hyped up. You're like, you know, third lie, which is much less obvious, fleeting almost, you wouldn't even know it unless you've studied the statue extensively, is that this man here is in fact not John Harvard. And then everyone goes, oh my God. And then it's like, so who is this man? This man here is not John Harvard. And the reason for that is because Daniel Chester French, as he was trying to create a statue of John Harvard, realized in his research that there was no existing visual depiction of John Harvard that existed at Harvard University or elsewhere for that matter. And that's because if you can remember back in 1764 when Harvard Hall burnt down, it took with it every single visual depiction of John Harvard that existed in every painting in the entire world. And so we have no clue what John Harvard looks like. We had no clue back in the 1870s. And so Daniel Chester French, he needed to get a very John Harvard-esque looking handsome man for this job. He was looking around Harvard University. He figured I might as well use a Harvard student to depict John Harvard. And the university suggested that he pick a very special undergraduate here by the name of Sherman Hoare. And so Sherman Hoare was actually not only a pretty prominent student at Harvard, pretty handsome looking guy, he was also the great nephew of one of the earliest presidents in Harvard's history. That's President Leonard Hoare, who was president, I believe, in the 1670s. And normally when Harvard, has a dormitory that, or normally when Harvard is trying to commemorate its presidents, it names a dormitory after them. We got, for example, Lowell House, named after, and dormitories at Harvard are called houses. We got Lowell House, named after President Abbott Lowell. We got, Adams House, named after President Josiah Quincy Adams. We have Winthrop House, named after, I believe, John Winthrop, who was a president of Harvard University, so on and so forth. However, there, to this day, at Harvard University does not exist a President Leonard Hoare House on campus. And this is for a couple reasons, as one might imagine. The foremost of which is that President Leonard Hoare was a very terrible president. He was actually one of the most widely hated figures in Harvard's history. And this was because he was stern, he was mean. He actually had 2 students publicly flogged in the middle of Harvard Yard, for example, like just mere feet from where we're standing today, for minor disciplinary action infractions in like 1674. And everyone was so pissed off that he did this to 2 students that in the middle of winter, the entire student body of Harvard decided, screw this, we're leaving, we're not coming back until President Leonard Hoare is no longer a president at this college. So the entire student body left, all like 35 people at the time. And they didn't leave until he was fired. And so he was very quickly fired, and he wasn't president for very long. And the historical record is not very nice towards President Leonard Hoare. And he didn't get a house named after him because, of course, Harvard didn't like the sound of having a whorehouse on campus. Haha. And so instead, by the late 1800s, they decided, let's let bygones be bygones and commemorate in some small way President Leonard Hoare's contribution to the university, because he did actually start off Harvard's science department. He was the first president to ever create greenhouses at Harvard. As someone who spends a lot of their time in greenhouses in the lab, I'm very thankful for greenhouses at Harvard. They add a lot of cool aspects to my studies. So thank you, President Leonard Hoare, for that. Harvard had a similar sentiment. They decided, why not we use Sherman, his nephew, as our model for the statue. So that's why, here today we have Sherman Hoare depicted lovely. And he's now the most photographed man in the entire United States, I like to say. So I think a very fitting, commemoration for Sherman and his distant relative, Leonard. So this is a statue, obviously, full of lies, as I've explained. However, in the statue full of lies, I think Daniel Chester French, our sculptor, included a little bit of perhaps a secret truth. And I've brought you over to this side of the statue so that you can view the plaque that's on the side of the pedestal. And this plaque has the logo of Harvard University in it. This logo, I'm sure you all have seen it before, is 3 books inside of a shield. And these books have letters inside of them that read out the word veritas, the Latin word that means truth in English. That's the translation. And that's really like the logo, the motto of Harvard University, to find truth, not only in academic, studies, but also otherwise in life more generally. And so in almost every depiction of this shield that you'll see, almost every depiction has all 3 books facing upwards, as though someone's reading them, like they're open, facing upwards. However, if you look very closely at this one, the final book in the bottom middle is face down. And a lot of people will say, and have said to me, Nathan, it's obvious why this book's face down, It's really hard to drop that A in the TAS, the A's in the middle of a book crease if you have the book facing upwards like the other ones. And to that I reply, don't be ridiculous. Daniel Chester French, he was one of the best sculptors we've ever had in America. If he wanted to make that happen, he could have made it happen. I think otherwise, Daniel Chester French was perhaps including a secret message in this statue, and that he was saying that sometimes to find the real veritas in things, perhaps you have to put at least some of your books down. Leave them face down on the table, look up, explore the world, and hopefully I've allowed you all to do a little bit of that exploration today on Harvard's campus. Thank you so much for coming on my tour. I really appreciate it. And of course, I'll stick around a little bit at the end for questions. Woo, that's all I got. So yeah, thanks for bearing with me. That was a wicked long tour. By my stopwatch, around an hour and 25 minutes. Obviously, you can't go that long, but I was trying to cram in every unique story I have. So just think about kind of the number I had, try and get a couple of your own to fit in that time, and you'll be chilling for the tour. But now feel free to, leave, or we'll start kind of like an office hours session where I can answer in a group setting, whatever questions you have about comp or my tours in general. But thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be on this.